Thank you, Chairman. I don't quite know where to start. When I look at this report, I don't think this tells you all of the leakage that's taking place. And when I look at the taxes that are being levied on farmers and small businesses that are forcing them to sell their farms and their businesses, and I look at this leakage, I mean, you talk about 1.5 billion here, I don't actually think you're probably capturing all of the leakage that's going on. So I think my question is to you, Jeremy. When I read in the NAA report, which I thought was excellent, and by the way, there is no room for complacency, as you said. I'm very glad to hear you're not complacent, because if I was on the end of a report like this, I'd certainly not be complacent. So when I read that the culture, let's look at the culture, a lack of trust between counter-fraud and police teams, and noted unclear lines of reporting, duplication, and missed investigative opportunities. I then read about siloed working between different teams, inefficiencies and duplication, and relatively few criminal investigations which tend not to be complex or serious. I then go on and I read something that really concerns me. We also found inconsistency in how seriously different parts of the MOD considered and responded to potential misconduct or fraud. Officials and police also told us that some areas of the MOD do not consider fraud to be a major risk and can be reluctant to engage. So I look at this, and I run lots of contracting business, we do lots of procurement, and I just don't think there's any joined-up thinking evident here at all. And you're going to be spending a lot more than you're currently spending. Your whatever it is, 46 billion, is likely to go up to 75 billion. So if these endemic sort of cultural and structural inefficiencies continue, there's going to be more leakage, and therefore more taxes are going to be required on the private sector. So I think this is really very concerning. And I'd like to know, Jeremy, really, how are you going to improve this, and are you going to give it the seriousness that it requires?
I said at the outset of this hearing, Mr. Lowe, that I take this seriously. There's absolutely no room for complacency. It's the heart of my job, the job of everyone on this panel, but the department as well, to make sure that we are maximising the value we get from every pound of taxpayers' spend. That requires the controls in place, it requires skills, it requires capability, but it does also require the right culture as well that you alluded to. I think some of the issues in the report, having spent a lot of time preparing for today, some of the issues sort of highlighted in the report reflect the complexity of the environment in which we are operating in the MOD. It is a very large, complex organisation. We have the military workforce, the civilian workforce. We have multiple different police forces that we are working with. But I want to assure you that I and the other senior leaders are placing great importance on the right culture of trust and collaboration. We have fresh leadership in the department, in the fraud defence team, and it's fantastic that we have Simon here today. And we have, in particular, I think, a new integrated investigative model that is really requiring all the different parties to come together, to work together collaboratively.
Can I just interrupt you, because you're talking generalities here. So let's go through the report. Theft of assets. Around 2/3 of these reports related to lost assets, with theft making up only 13%. Can you define lost assets? Question. Personnel and management issues and information exploitation. Failure to follow gifts and hospitality rules, abuse of flexible working time, and deceit and misrepresentation of financial advantage. Unlawfully obtaining and disclosing official documentation. I mean, look, this is serious stuff. So please don't talk generalities. What are you practically going to do to sort this out?
There is no disagreement.
These aren't generalities. These are actual events.
There is no disagreement between us on the seriousness and the importance of the issue. I will talk specifically about assets, and then I will talk about the wider strategy to deal with fraud, because there is actually a whole set of different issues that you are raising there. control of assets is very important in a department like the Ministry.
So what is something lost? When you say lost assets, most of them are apparently lost. What does that mean? Does anyone get punished for losing an asset? In my business, if somebody loses an asset, if there's no justification for losing it, they have to pay for it.
We record and follow up all lost assets. The process is underpinned by our security control framework. A majority of our lost assets relate to phones or laptops, and as you can imagine, we want to ensure that we track those carefully. The response will, as you rightly note, depend on the justification given. We will absolutely be alive to any patterns if we think they are occurring, but the majority are cases of misplacement of phones and laptops, but we will record the reason and where it happens.
You can have as many risk
registers,
as many processes, as many sort of analytical tools. In the end, you've got to send people to prison for being dishonest, and that's what you would do. I know we've got issues with the courts who don't punish people properly, but in the end, people have got to fear that when they break the law, when they're deceitful, when they steal, they go to prison. So I'm just going to go on and ask you a few more things. Because you talked about prescriptive or nominated procurement. You mentioned that. So in my businesses, we have an annual review or 6-month review of where all the spend goes. Biggest supplier first. We then review those. We then have a discussion with those suppliers. We ask them for rebates. We actually discuss proactively with them how we can reduce the cost to our business. Because in the private sector, we're being loaded with taxes, with national insurances, with all sorts of stuff that is leaking out the side through the MOD procurement, clearly. So do you have those meetings? When people nominate suppliers, I'm immediately suspicious. Why are you nominating a supplier? Is there some further dishonesty going on? Because you often don't need to necessarily, unless there's a really good reason, you don't need to nominate. So look, there's loads of stuff that we need to be doing here.
Should we just let them answer a little bit and then you can come back?
Yeah, but we don't want to talk generalities, Geoffrey. We want
I'll just give one specific and then hand over to Jim to talk about oversight of suppliers. One specific is the department is now using the new powers available to us in the Procurement Act 2023 to require suppliers to disclose conflicts of interest that they have a new duty on to ensure that we are bearing down on exactly those issues that you have raised. And just another thing I'll just say in the brief hand of Jim is obviously preparing for the hearing. I've spent a lot of time with the teams and our lawyers asking about what's actually happening in the department to try and get that understanding. I am aware of cases where our commercial lawyers have found issues and have said, hang on, we think this might pass the criminal threshold, where the intent is such that it might pass the criminal threshold, and either reported the case to the police or criminal counsel to take that matter further, saying there's not more that we need to do in the department, but this is something we take very seriously. Mr. Lowe specifically asked about how we oversee and manage our relationship with suppliers. That's Jim's role, so I'll hand over to Jim.
Briefly, please, Jim.
We absolutely do robustly manage the performance of our suppliers to deliver to schedule, cost and time. We also, though, specifically pick up on this point around how they are managing fraud through reviews with them. So we check about their whistleblowing frameworks, their ethics, their supply chain risks, their modern slavery compliance, and we make sure, because your question was more broadly around culture, and obviously we have mandatory fraud and corruption training for kind of commercial staff, but we also set expectations on our supply chain that they also conduct that training.
But on your whistleblowing line, for instance, I mean, if you run a whistleblowing line, you've got to make it effective. You had 1,037 cases, of which I think 363 ended up being properly investigated by the police. If you don't have a properly functioning whistleblowing line, people won't whistleblow. But anyway, I think I've covered that off. But I've got one last question because I know we're under time pressure. So when the MOD, in their conclusion, says the MOD has an opportunity to save money through better coordination and management of its counter-fraud and economic crime activity. So Jeremy, in order to make that happen, you've got to not only change the culture, you've got to pull together all the departments so there is a common approach to how you're going to save the taxpayer money. The poor taxpayer who is being abused here, we need to make sure they're looked after. So how are you going to do that? How are you going to pull this together? And how are you going to stop it being siloed?
That is at the heart of our revised counter-fraud strategy that we are working on, taking into account our internal work and the findings of the report. In an organisation as large and complex as the MOD, that requires a systemic approach across the system for us to operate at multiple different levels. First of all, it requires us to continue to refine our estimate. That's important in its own right, but it also means it gives us a clue where should we go after. Where should we work harder because we think there might be fraud or other things that are creating risk here. That's about leadership. We've talked about that. It's about also particularly about Aneen's role as DG Finance, having particular responsibility on Exco and on our board for that as well. It's about how each area, each team in the department oversees that. Then specifically, you asked about the hotline as well and how we deal with people who raise concerns. We think the confidential hotlines are a very good thing, but we need to rationalise the number of hotlines that we have in the Ministry of Defence. Very large, complex. Some of the hotlines do different things. It's not just about financial crime. We've also need people to report concerns about staff behaviour, just to give you another example as well. So we need to rationalise the number and the approach. We need that integrated investigative model that we've also talked about. There's more that we could say about that. We also need to look at our case management system as well. So this requires a systemic approach. Ultimately, it also does require leadership, it requires culture, and it requires, including in hearings like today, because this is also a way for this hearing will be seen by many people in the Ministry of Defence. It also requires me to be saying today, this matters. This is something that all leaders in my department should be taking seriously.
So well, just on that, perhaps you should start by getting your counter-fraud and the police teams to actually trust and work together. And that's your cultural problem. If people don't work together, nothing happens. So look, I think, Jeffrey, I've done my bit for now.